Welcome to the Gnostic Warrior. How are you doing today, Stephen?
I'm doing well, sir.
Great. It's great to have you on the show. And I've been a follower, as I had mentioned before we started the recording of your blog for several years now. You've been at it, as you had mentioned, for about a decade. But before we get into the great work you're doing now, can you let the audience know a little bit about who you are and your background?
Sure. I mean, there's not really much to tell. I was born actually in the same town in Virginia that I currently work in, sadly. I spent the first 10 years or so of my life in West Virginia. We relocated to Florida around the time I was in like third grade or so. So I spent a good chunk of my life in Florida, about 20 years or so there. Probably one of the formative experiences in my young life was being involved in the remnants, I should say, of the Florida death metal scene. I personally really don't like death metal very much. People always would kind of come up with these bands with me, and I'm like, dude, I heard the stuff years ago, but I never really looked at the groups. But I found the whole subculture of it to be really, really fascinating. And I kind of think that's one of the reasons why subsequently I've always been kind of attracted to these extreme cultures. It was just kind of the process of being experienced to it when I was a teenager with, some of the guys that were involved in that stuff. Of course, you got some of the black metaler types that did the whole satanic thing. And God, I mean, I have one buddy who dug up like a corpse actually to get the skull out of the casket so he could use as a stage prop during one of his concerts, man. I mean, there was just some crazy guys involved in that whole scene.
Yeah,
So
that's interesting. I find a kind of a common thread with some of us that are interested into the occult or things that people might consider dark and might be afraid to venture into research. I think it takes a specific personality and someone with our background. I was into hardcore punk rock, but as you had mentioned with death metal and heavy metal, there's different fringes, like your friend, and I knew people like that, but I was more averse to that, and I didn't really like that. And there was different types of punk. There was of course hardcore punk and the
mm,
and then I was more into the melodic kind of wise punk. There was bands like Bad Religion, Pennywise.
oh yeah, I
Um,
remember them.
yeah, so there was things that I was more interested into. So I kind of get where you're coming from, and kind of helped a little bit when I got into this type of work. And I do a lot of spiritual research, and I'm looking into what we call demonic activity of the human race, and I'm finding this common thread. But it is a dark rabbit hole to go down, and you have to have a strong character. And again, your blog, you go over some interesting subjects. So talk about what led you into starting your blog, your website that led into today.
Well, it went into like I was kind of telling you before we got going. I mean, it originally started as like kind of a ghost hunting thing, but the genesis of that like really kind of went back to the time I was briefly living in Colorado Springs, University of Colorado at Colorado Springs. I was in the dorms then. This would have been, I think, around 2003, and this would have been the first time that I actually did any psychedelics. I tried to do LSD a couple of years before, but didn't get a big enough dose. So this time I took some magic mushrooms at the dorm. The trip was pretty standard, for most of it. But then towards the end, it was probably like around midnight or something like that, and decided to go over to the cafeteria because I was starting to get a little hungry at that point. The cafeteria was like a big kind of white setup, I mean, with the walls and everything, and kind of like the stainless steel tables that the food's on. So I walk into this cafeteria, and this suddenly I see it like in this kind of engulfed in like this gray fog or something like that everywhere. And I see like these full blown like gray aliens like walking around like amongst the students, like kind of observing them and what have you. I mean, it was the strangest thing that I've ever had happen to me when I was tripping. Tripped quite a few times since then, but nothing ever quite like that before. But the whole thing was seeing the gray aliens there became kind of an obsession with me, and I started to wonder if other people had seen something like that, like extraterrestrials and altered states of consciousness. And that had led me to studying some of Rick Strassman's work on DMT. Of course, that was kind of a common theme in some of the research that they did at the University of Arizona. The remote viewing program was another one that I kind of got into with that. And that was where, kind of the whole idea with exploring like these channeled communications and things like that came from, and that was sort of like what led to the ghost hunting thing. And then later, some of the early, articles I wrote for FISUP. I mean, I think the first one I actually wrote was this piece called Contact, which is still one of the most widely read ones that I've written. And it pretty much all went into that, UFOs that you see on DMT, remote viewing, and kind of the overlap of psychedelics and psi and that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about the gray aliens. I had an experience on LSD. I actually had several, but one of my first ones was actually they were more like people mixed with aliens, and I was at the beach with my friends. Yeah, and they were coming out. We went down to this cliff area, and we were walking down, and they were all in the trees. There was trees surrounding the kind of the camping area, and I was like the only one who could see them. And they started coming, like hundreds of them, like it was almost like a zombie apocalypse, and I was just going like, guys, do you see those guys, and I was like, they're like aliens, and and then they finally like felt something, but I got everybody to kind of get out of there. But I'll always remember that experience. So I've also had that kind of spiritual experience and several in the past. What do you take as, I know we're not really, this isn't about aliens, the podcast, and demons and so forth. What is your take now after all these years, those experiences, your research? Do you believe that these are entities in a different dimension, possibly when we take something like psilocybin or LSD that we're able to tap into, or certain people are to see?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a good chance of that. I mean, after years of sort of studying this phenomenon, I mean, I think the way that it interacts with human consciousness is absolutely crucial to it, which is why I do think with psychedelics, it can be useful to accessing those kinds of planes, if you will. I mean, really, that's kind of like the whole purpose, I mean, of almost all ritualism and what have you. I mean, I kind of subscribe to Peter Levenda's view of it as all being technology or techniques, essentially. You find what works for you to apply to get you into the right headspace that you can have those kinds of experiences.
Yeah, that's kind of the religious thing. And I think as time has evolved, those experiences have also, but if we look at, the psychedelics and the history of it, it seems like we've been tapping in to the mushroom for some reason. And I feel it has something to do with our physiology. And then of course, going back, and somehow, this mushroom helps us go there like steroids, to the moon or whatever.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Well,
As opposed to other techniques.
Well, there was like that theory that I think it was Terence McKenna. It was probably McKenna who had that what mushrooms were originally from outer space, spores or something like that had come on like an asteroid. So
yeah, and they're finding now. I mean, who knows with science, but they're finding it 33,000 feet up in the air, right? And they're finding it on the space station. They talk about this blob in the air, and it was affecting the astronauts' health. So it's interesting that we're finding out the science, and then also that we possibly evolved from the fungus, right? I don't know if you've heard that. So it's interesting that, if we evolved from fungus, and this is where we evolved, and then they're finding it in outer space, and Terence McKenna was right. And then we take this mushroom that magically kind of transports us into that realm. It's as if we are these spores having kind of like a human experience, so, but yeah, it's interesting. So let's go along with, again, with your research. What happened after you saw these aliens, and then what brought you to the parapolitics and so forth?
Well, I mean, it was actually quite a few years after that I really started to get involved in the research seriously. I mean, I had a lot of, let's just say, personal problems in like my 20s that I had to kind of like work through. Though oddly, the research was actually, I think, rather useful, in resolving a lot of those problems when I started doing it, like around 2007, 2008. I mean, it's kind of like the whole Discordian mindset, I mean, the big reason why I think Robert Anton Wilson pushed 23 so much, it's really irrelevant what the number means. It could have been any number at all, but it's a way of kind of training you to recognize synchronicity, if you will. And I think conspiracy theories are sort of similar in that regard. I mean, in a lot of ways, it's almost irrelevant if they're true or not. The big thing about conspiracy theories is they train you to sort of take an alternative view of reality. And I think in the process of sort of exploring these, it started to, give me the courage, I guess you will, to sort of adopt a worldview that was outside of consensus reality.
And you believe there are conspiracies, obviously, if you follow your
Yeah,
website, right?
yeah. I mean, I try to kind of distinguish now with, parapolitics, which to me is more of like a serious historical study of this kind of stuff, and conspiracy theories, which are more entertainment and, kind of mind exercises, if you will. I mean, I do think that's something that more and more people need to start making a distinction between.
Yeah, which conspiracies, what you're talking about, the entertainment would be vague references around a certain subject with no real scholarly work and references and links and citations to actual facts that happened in history, which if you want to validate your work and people to take it serious, you need to have that, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like the stuff with like, let's take Atlantis, for example. I mean, I know a lot of people feel very strongly about Atlantis, but yeah, the historical record for that is lacking, to put it mildly. I mean, it's one of those things like, yeah, it's fun to do all of this, speculation about, but I mean, I think it was like a couple of years ago on Facebook, there was like a poll or something like whether people would rather be able to see the lost continent of Atlantis or the Library of Alexandria. The whole thing is the Library of Alexandria was real. And we could have probably figured out if Atlantis actually did have a basis in reality if we saw the Library of Alexandria. So, yeah, that's kind of where, to me, people need to kind of prioritize a little more between something that's actually tangible to something that's mainly speculation or maybe even meant to be taken from purely a symbolic level, if you will.
Yeah, I agree. And when I've researched Atlantis, I always look at the, back to the Greeks and where we get a lot of these so-called myths. They always allegorized the true story and embellished it within myths. So, some of it I believe was true, and then some I don't. When I researched Atlantis, I always go back to Crete. Crete had a significant play, and it was called the holy, I call it the holy island of Crete, but
Mhm.
I believe for thousands of years Crete and the various islands around there was like a mini Atlantis. And we get the story, I believe, of Atlantis from Plato's Timaeus and Critias, right? And he tells us the story. He always talks in dialogues, but my understanding, it was Crete, and that was a big significant island. And I do a lot of work on Crete, and say for the tribe of Judah, Mount Ida is on Crete, and the Idumeans and Jerusalem. If you look at the history of Josephus, he talks about the Judeans coming from Mount Ida, and they were called Idumeans. And so when I researched that, the only place that was Crete. And then if you research back to that time, and the historians Strabo and Philo, they'll talk about Crete being Jerusalem and the Jews coming from that island. And they fled when the Romans took it over, Titus, back in the day. So it's an interesting story. And again, this isn't about my research, it's about your research. So these conspiracies over time, we're in the year 2021. My research goes back to the year, when Augustus changed the calendar and he took over Greco-Roman Egypt. I think it was 8 AD, and added the 2 months, and here we are. What's your thoughts on the conspiracies and the secret societies and everything that you've seen and documented since that time? What is the main premise, do you believe, behind the conspiracy, but behind mankind to keep us kind of dumbed down and for us not to know the truth?
You mean like in modern times or like throughout history or?
Yeah, like if you were to, let's go like throughout history, like if we were to go back and again, I believe, if we go back to 8 AD and, our calendars have been changed, all kinds of different things have been changed, when Augustus took over the Roman Empire, and we're in the year 2021. And you do, a lot of your research deals with, the far right and politics and secret societies that are somehow tied in to Christianity, either the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church, and they seem to always be intertwined with everything. And then we also have the Freemasons, of course, and the Knights of Malta, and the Knights of St. John, and so forth. So there's obviously a religious tie here as well. So that's why, I thought, maybe you have an idea, if you've ever thought about what was the purpose of all this, if we were to go back in time and then go to now.
Well, I mean, I think generally, I mean, a lot of this has just been attempts at social control by various like leaders throughout human history. I mean, obviously the modern construct of Christianity that we currently have was largely the creation of Constantine. And it came about, I mean, at a very complicated time in Rome's history. Of course, this is coming after the crisis of the 3rd century, where they had like 40 emperors in a span of like 50 years or something like that. I mean, basically every other year you've got this brutal civil war. It just, it utterly decimated much of the heartlands. And this is really, I think, also where you had kind of the onset of feudalism and that type of thing, the collapse of the Roman state. So, in that point of time, you were trying to craft some kind of religion that essentially could maintain social control as faith in public institutions were breaking down. But I mean, that really kind of seems has been the thrust really throughout history through a lot of these like ruling elites. It's an attempt to try to craft a more perfect system of social control. I mean, in the 20th century, I mean, I think the big thing was effectively cybernetics, which, is essentially now what most of all modern societies are organized around, and the whole concept of feedback loops and so forth. But then again, I mean, as Eric Davis and Technosis kind of argue somewhat compellingly, cybernetics is almost a modernized form of Gnosticism. So, again, it's kind of an interesting dynamic. And that's kind of another thing, too, about these, these various aspects of social control that the elites have crafted over the years. It always kind of seems like in the best laid plans to control society, there's always those means of their own destruction sewn into it as well.
Definitely. I mean, and if we look at the concept of religion, I grew up Roman Catholic. I consider myself a Gnostic, but also a Christian. And it's weird because, I went away from Christianity when I was younger. I became a hardcore punk rock. I believe like an atheist. I didn't believe in God. I kind of laughed at Christians because I always saw them, well, within my life as hypocrites, because they seemed to act the opposite of what they were allegedly teaching or what was taught in the scripture.
How old are you, by the way?
I'm 49, going to be 50 in July.
Okay. So you're a little older than me. All right. So you probably didn't get to experience the What Would Jesus movement, What Would Jesus Do movement. That was something else.
Yeah. So here's where I'm going with that is if we look at the concepts of Christianity, and I look at you and you tell me about your history. I don't know what you do on your own, but you seem to be the most part a decent guy, a nice guy. You probably treat people how you want to be treated. You're not going around hitting people and whatever, and you're saying thank you and hello, and for the most part you're living almost like the Christian precepts of life. And I look at our society and we look at history to now. I do agree with you that they did choose this as a way to manage their empire and their religion of choice. And it seems like throughout time, these adopted civilization, as far as here in the West, adopted Christianity to be the main religion. And when people actually operate in that aspect, whether they're Christian or not, but they treat people how they want to be treated and whatever it may be, it seems like the world operates pretty good for the most part. You know what I mean? As opposed to, my idea of satanic, and I've done a lot of research in Satanism, and I believe I was more satanic when I got into punk rock and the things that I did, and I didn't treat people how I wanted to be treated and would make money however I needed to do it. And I ended up going to jail and getting a drug addiction and things that ended up destroying my life and relationships when I did the opposite and maybe the satanic route. And as you know, doing the research into this, it could go to different realms of Satanism, right? People could go all the way on the fringes, just like they can in the music realm, they can in the satanic realm. And there's something spiritual seems to be happening there, where you're getting flipped over and you're giving yourself over to the flesh, and you end up getting destroyed as well. So what I'm saying is that, when we look at the teachings of Christianity, and we look at the teachings of, say, Satanism, and what do you feel as far as the ideas of running the world? What would it be better to have some type of satanic guy and cult guy running things, or maybe a Christian, even if they're far right or whatever, but they go by those ideals and they actually practice them. Doesn't mean they won't kill you if they don't need to, and they're not nefarious things are going around in the world of politics. Who would you rather be ruling?
Well, I mean, I think you would have to go with the Christian despot for the simple reason that the satanic one would collapse inevitably. I mean, I think when you really get down to it, I mean, satanic ideology is essentially libertarianism or objectivism, Randism, whatever you want to call it. I mean, it's just the total glorification of the individual to the expense of all else, you know. And when you go down this mindset, eventually everything can become permitted in the name of personal freedom, which is why, I mean, when you dig into enough of these libertarian forums, when issues like, you know, the sexual abuse of children come up, a lot of these people don't have a good counter to that, because ultimately, well, it's his right if he wants to go abuse the kid, and if the kid, you know, is all right with it, well, why should we intervene in this? Well, I mean, the problem is that's kind of a sociopathical construct ultimately. I mean, when you're going to continuously elevate selfishness to that level, it's going to become self-destructive. I mean, you know, again, Christianity, for all its faults, I do think at least promoted a sense of community and certainly a notion of self-sacrifice for the greater good, which are instrumental, I think, in sustaining a healthy society.
I agree. And I know, again, there's going to be critics, of the Christians, meaning that there's people that on the Christian side are satanic and they do abuse children, and I agree with that, and they don't go by the precepts. I don't.
Well, also too, I mean, I think you have to distinguish essentially what passes for Christianity in most of the mainstream churches now was essentially created by people like J. Howard Pugh and psychological warfare officers in the Pentagon for the purposes of the Cold War. So then this is something, again, growing up in the South in the 90s, I obviously had a lot of hostility to Christians when I was younger. And it took me a long time to try to come to the realization that I needed to separate the religion from the political ideology that had been crafted out of it during the Cold War, because it's really not fair to the religion to judge it by the likes of Jerry Falwell and these other characters who are probably historically insignificant in the grand scheme of the religion.
Yeah, I agree. And there's, of course, people that use it for profit and, in satanic ways and so forth. So,
yes, the prosperity gospel.
Yeah. So what do you think the purpose is? Again, I want to go into more of your work, and I know we're going a little bit off here. There's no script, of course. When I'm talking, I like just to have a kind of a free flow discussion. What do you think that the plan is? You see things happening right now, with the coronavirus, things are getting locked down. Whatever your take is on that, and then what do you think is happening with the ultimate plan? With humanity and with this lockdown with the coronavirus?
Well, I mean, the whole thing with the lockdown, I mean, is so complicated, I think, to really get a read on it right now. Because, I mean, yes, nominally, it kind of seems like it's fulfilling a lot of these, New World Order conspiracy theories that have been in play now for decades. But I mean, on the flip side of the coin, there's just stuff about it that is so sketchy. I mean, first off, it's like you kind of roll out this whole thing with the vaccine and possibly having chips in it and all this other insanity, like all the way back in March 2020. So, I mean, you've given the anti-vaxxers close to a year to mobilize by the time the vaccine actually starts to get here. This is a discussion I have with John Brisson. We've read the documents. John chronicles the vaccine thing and has for years now. And John told me one of the most striking things he sees about the whole thing with COVID is the fact that the deaths related to the vaccine actually are being reported by mainstream sources. I mean, they're trying to downplay them, but typically in the past when this type of thing went on, I mean, you would never even hear any of the stuff mentioned at all in mainstream media sources. It was totally blacked out. So it's getting acknowledged subtly. So it's just very interesting how it's creating this this contrast in the message that the public is being fed, where there's this sort of like constant drumbeat about how wonderful the vaccine is and it's crucial to getting back to like normal society. But then at the same token, there's also this kind of subtle hint that there's, all these deaths that are being unreported about it and this type of thing. So it just seems to me like this is going to cause insane amounts of chaos going forward. I mean, there's already just so much evidence coming out with the vaccine being unsafe, with it not even stopping COVID in the first place. I mean, it really looks like this is not going to end well.
Yeah, I agree that it seems there's two narratives going, and they're both being at play, and you still have people, of course, getting the vaccine and going, and they're looking like those states and the people that are getting the vaccine, the COVID cases are increasing as if these people are now
and then
getting
Texas, Texas just totally opened up again, and I mean their COVID rates are going down. I mean, again, they might be massaging the numbers, who knows at this point, but yeah, it just seems like it's continuously polarizing the country. And it's really getting people to dig in. I mean, especially with the people who tend to be I should say probably there's a lot of fanatical anti-vaxxers out there too, but I mean, the pro-vaxxers, it's just, they literally blame anybody who has questions about the vaccine for why they can't, go back to their normal lives, essentially. This is just really pitting Americans more against other Americans at a time when the nation is as divided as at any point it's been in this history. So
I agree, and I look at, how we're divided, and it's the ideas and how we think about certain subjects. And, because of the chaos, and, I believe certain people don't do research, and they're moved by the media and whatever's going out there, and kind of the mainstream narrative. They go by whatever is told to them, and they're not open to this type of stuff, and to listening to alternative views and knowledge. So what do you, let's go back a little bit to you started your blog, and you're getting into parapolitics and so forth, and you're finding kind of the conspiracy. And I believe your work, the body of it more entails what's going on in the United States of America, which I feel is kind of unique. There's people doing parapolitics, and it's more of a international thing. Even though you get into that, I feel you document more of the players in United States and history, and more so, would you say, like the last 50 years?
Yeah, I mean, I would say probably. Well, that's sort of, I think, was an offshoot of, I think really when the blog started to come into its own. I mean, I would say when I started writing for the first year or two, I mean, a lot of the stuff that I was doing were fairly conventional conspiracy takes, with some synchromysticism mixed in. But a big thing that really happened was when I started looking at the Oklahoma City bombing. And that was kind of the first time I had started to look into like the whole militia culture and that type of thing. And it was really eye-opening, because you start peeling the layers back and you start seeing just how tied up a lot of these guys were to the US intelligence community and what have you. And it's just like, whoa, you never hear Bill Cooper talk about this kind of stuff. In fact, I mean, he would always be going on about how great the militias are and this type of thing. And then, as I started digging into it more and more, it's like, no, this is actually the American wing of Gladio, and we should actually be really terrified by this shit if these militias are ever activated on a large scale in this country. So that was really a pivotal moment for me.
All right, so let's so what are your thoughts on, let's talk about Gladio and the OSS and all that, your research into that, and the formation of, say, the CIA.
From the Office of Strategic Services and how Gladio played into all that.
Yeah.
Well, sort of the entity that kind of filled the gap between the time of the OSS and then later, like the CIA, was this company called the World Commerce Corporation that was set up, I think, almost immediately after the Second World War, within like literally, I think, 3 weeks or something of it coming to an end. And it had all of these heavies in both the US and the UK intelligence community. I mean, a big guy was Sir William Stevenson, aka Intrepid. He effectively had ran all of the British operations in North America during the war. William Donovan would eventually end up there. Of course, he was the founder and head of the Office of Strategic Services and whatnot. So the OSS is disbanded in the aftermath of the Second World War, and all of this priceless talent is unemployed now, or some such shit. And the WCC was kind of dubbed as being a good way to get these guys jobs, you know, while we're doing the behind the scenes stuff to get the CIA set up. And in this capacity, the WCC was actually one of the first groups to help set up some of these Gladio networks in Europe. You know, was able to come up some references to Donovan doing this kind of work in Italy while he was in charge with the World Commerce Corporation. But a lot of these guys who ended up in the WCC were veterans of these so-called Jedburgh networks, which had been set up during the Second World War. And this was essentially where the Gladio stuff had originated from. You know, these were commandos who were dropped into France prior to the Allied invasion, and effectively they were there to do all these sabotage operations against the Nazis and that type of thing, you know, essentially to prepare the field of battle for the Allied forces. And that was, in theory, what the Gladio networks themselves would do in the Cold War era. Essentially, the Russians invaded, and then these guys, along with U.S. Special Forces, would harass the Russian military while, you know, we got an appropriate response ready to go. Anyway, that was the theory. Unfortunately, a lot of ex-Nazis and that type of thing were recruited into these networks, and also a very heavy element of criminal elements, which also probably came from the World Commerce Corporation, considering another one of its major obsessions in the immediate aftermath of the war was relaunching the international drug trade. Some interesting stuff with that, because I mean, they had so many ties to the KMT regime in Taiwan with Chiang Kai-shek, which was basically nothing but a glorified narco state. And then they ended up owning like all these pharmaceutical companies, essentially, like in the West. And for years, there was this arrangement where essentially like raw opiates came over from Asia. They went to these pharmaceutical companies where they were refined into heroin, and then they just, you know, disappeared. Nobody knew, but then they ended up with the mafia. So it kind of seems like the WCC was another one of the guys who were sort of setting up these networks. And unfortunately, it's created a very murky netherworld, because all of this was done by a private company. So there are no Freedom of Information Act requests for this. But I would imagine that what became, you know, the sort of what we would think of as the modern Gladio networks tied in with these far-right paramilitary groups, with these criminal organizations involved in drugs trafficking, arms trafficking, sex trafficking. All of this probably came from what the World Commerce Corporation was doing in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, in relaunching these kind of black networks, if you will, as a means to sort of pave the way for the Cold War.
So do you believe that was the means, or was this to kind of control the markets, you know, and would you say this was also the formation of the modern deep state?
Yeah, this was definitely very much, I mean, the formation of the modern deep state. I mean, I think a lot of it too had to do with this just sort of overlap with the British and all of this. Obviously, the UK had had its own equivalent of a deep state for a very long time. Sir William Stevenson is essentially the guy who set up the OSS. I mean, Donovan gets the credit for it, but this was all modeled on the ideals that Stevenson had, essentially. The British, of course, had a long and robust history of drug trafficking and all that good stuff in Asia. So I think there was also this sort of factor, rubbing elbows with the cousins during the Second World War, seeing how the empire was run, probably had a bad influence on some of these guys in the States. We thought it would be a really wonderful idea if we tried to emulate the British while simultaneously cutting them out of these rackets, which caused a lot of other issues later on. But yeah, I think that was very much sort of the beginning of the modern deep state, and just this sort of black nexus where, you know, you had all this off the books funding for these insane projects and that type of stuff. And obviously that's led to a lot of later speculation about, you know, breakaway civilizations and this kind of insanity.
Would you believe this was another, like the deep state, these nefarious activities involving drugs? And of course, we now see in the United States of America, we're flooded with drugs, and the drug epidemic is a huge problem. I myself have struggled with issues, during my life. I have a son. I know several people. I know a lot of people that have died and haven't made it to see their 30, their 20th birthday, let alone their 50th. Do you believe this was a social engineering thing to control people again as well?
I mean, I don't know if the drug trade started as such. In fact, I mean, I think there was maybe an attempt to keep some of the drugs out of domestic markets, at least, outside of, or excluding minority markets, of course. But certainly, as time went on, it became more of an issue of social control. But there's always been that debate. I mean, Nixon seems like he really vigorously tried to stop the heroin trade going into the United States in the late 60s, early 70s, to the point where he effectively set up a death squad in the Drug Enforcement Agency and had them going around the world knocking off French gangsters and what have you. So at various times, I do think leaders have worried that the drug issue in the country could become devastating to the extent that it would affect our military capabilities. But I don't know if that's really been a concern for decades now, though, unfortunately.
Yeah.
It just,
So
it
like
just kind of
go ahead.
it just kind of seemed like, I mean, as social unrest increased, throughout the 60s going into the 70s, it was kind of, decided that it was better to have, these elements of society that couldn't get on board with the military industrial complex strung out on heroin and then later crack and coke and this type of thing. And then also it became a major, money-making bonanza for these guys when the war on drugs really got going under the Reagan and Bush years. Which I think really, I mean, led this to just absolute barbarism. I mean, it's bad enough that you're doping your own populace, but now it's like you're doping them and you're not even going to provide them with any means of like medical help for this. You're just basically going to throw people in prison to make money off of them, which is only going to exacerbate the drug problem in the first place. So it's, yeah.
Yeah, and do you believe like the formation of the deep state, and then you had mentioned the mafias and all the various criminal networks, and we see a lot of it is, of course, not, of course, tied to the CIA or the deep state. There's people selling drugs and killing people and little militia groups that have nothing to do with them. It's as if it created this network or this worldwide web of dark activities that a lot of people get into because there's a lot of money to be made, right? Because people are drawn to it for the quick money, and before you know it, you're in the world of drugs and sales. Do you believe that it started out as that, and then it eventually got to the point now where they don't have their hands in, of course, every dealer or every mafioso's hands? And then what are your thoughts as far as them controlling it still at the top, though, even though they might not be controlling every dealer and every mafia boss?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that, yeah, the sort of sprawl that you're alluding to was really very much an offshoot of these crimes that the deep state was perpetuating. And I should probably point out, like, specifically with a lot of, former ex-intelligence officers, there's generally an assumption, like whenever these guys, show up in illicit activity, that they're doing this covertly for the CIA or the Pentagon or what have you. But I really don't think that's the case. I mean, a fair amount of these guys are also running rackets on the side just to, line their own pockets. I mean, to give you an example of that, but like one would be the so-called Golden Lily Fund, which was allegedly this World War II era gold that the Japanese had looted from Asia and that they had buried in these vaults in the Philippines and so forth. No, most likely something like that did happen and there was some gold, but you had all of these military officers that knew about it. And it seems like when these guys got out of the service going back into the US, I mean, they start pawning off like these gold certificates. Basically you pay, a couple of $1 million for one of these gold certificates, and now you have access to $20 million of gold bars in the Philippines, that kind of crap. And I mean, they even managed to ensnare some pretty big guys like the financier Samuel Israel at one point. So I do think with a lot of these ex-spooks, they start these kind of confidence games, they get involved in drug trafficking, and it really has nothing to do with any kind of coherent government agenda. It's just a way to line their pockets, and then other people start getting into it, and eventually it just turns into this massive network that's been totally divorced from any kind of official sanction whatsoever.
So it's as if they get to, once they retire, they could do whatever they want and then they got friends in high places. If anything happens,
Yeah,
they got
yeah.
backup, right?
Because I mean, that's, and that's kind of the thing. I mean, when these guys leave, the Pentagon or the CIA or whatever, the networks that they put together, they don't just disappear. And I mean, that was one of the, issues that we really, I think, started to uncover going into the 70s, which was one of the only times there actually was an attempt to, reform the intelligence services. So you fire guys like General John Sinclair, you fire guys like Theodore Shackley. Now they're private citizens again, but they've still got all these contacts. They still have access to all of this funding from these, black activities that they helped set up. So, there's no way that you can get rid of these networks now. And yeah, now that these guys are not under any kind of formal supervision, I think the temptation to cash in on this access was, it was not something that they could hold out.
Yeah, and it seems that a lot of these activities that you mentioned in my own research, and I've had, when you're in this line of work, you do come across who, whether they're CIA agents now or secret agents, whoever they might be, they're always involved in this kind of nefarious realm, and then fooling people and either taking their money or just kind of leading some kind of narrative as well in the conspiracy movement. What are your thoughts there? With them being involved in this movement, and then also a lot of the work that they do, whether it be a scam, as you had mentioned with the gold, or it's kind of fooling people.
You mean in terms of conspiracy theories?
Yeah. Sometimes what I believe is they control some of the conspiracy movement, and then they fool people rather than, you give citations, you give references, you know better. Then there's the people that just these ridiculous conspiracies, and some of them are the biggest websites and podcasts and, things in
Yeah,
this
yeah.
movement, and I feel they're pretty much a joke. And they're kind of like CIA Iran, and it's a joke.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, and I mean, I think a lot of this is just a way to cash in ultimately. I mean, look at a guy like Michael Flynn. I mean, how much money is this guy making off of the QAnon stuff right now? And I mean, you could say the same thing about like Alex Jones and some of these other characters. So, I mean, I do think at least some of this, there are some pretty cynical mercenary reasons for why they weave these conspiracy narratives. It's kind of like the same thing when you get into ufology, for instance. I mean, if you've really looked at ufology, you sort of know that the community has been manipulated for, God, probably almost 50 years now by a group of largely ex-spooks that are usually referred to as the aviary, quote unquote. But these guys are they're epic hucksters. I shouldn't say all of them. I mean, I haven't found necessarily anything too nefarious in some of them, but some of the other ones, though, yeah, they turn up in some really sketchy stuff and have for years. And it just gets to the point where, you've got guys that are trying to pass off like gyroscopes as being like reverse engineered UFO technology as a way of like roping in wealthy investors and this kind of thing. So the stakes for some of this stuff get very high, which is, I think, something else that a lot of normal people don't realize. I mean, there's big money in conspiratainment. I mean, especially in the last 10 years or so. I mean, just look at Alex Jones. So yeah, I do think that kind of plays into how some of this stuff is constructed. I mean, I know it's kind of hard for people to believe that, conspiracy theories would be manufactured for the terms of merchandising. But I mean, you can already kind of see this starting in the late 80s with the rise of the alternate reality games. I mean, the first one was Ong's Hat, and Joseph Matheny deliberately started incorporating elements of Montauk into it. So the whole Montauk mythos bleeds into that. And then, I mean, he and Peter Moon are writing books, to promote all this stuff and, probably making a little on the side. So, yeah.
Yeah. And do you believe, I mean, of course, there's money to be made, and then there's also controlling knowledge. Some of us are into serious research. I look at, my research and going back, 10, 12 years, and it was just wanting to know what really was going on, and seeing Alex Jones actually was one of the first people I think a lot of us come across, when we're kind of looking into the so-called truth movement, and, we learn about chemtrails, and then we start going, yeah, there, and it's just kind of this progress, and, yours was aliens and different things. But it eventually you go out of the Alex Jones and you get into the truth, and, there's people making money, but I believe people like yourself and myself, I don't even actually, I was doing a Patreon. I still have it up. I think I have $2 coming in a month, because I just don't actively, I'd rather than ask for money all the time. I just have a job and I own my own business. So I figured I'd do that. And then this is what I do. This is what I love to do and I enjoy to do. But I also know it could be dangerous. I've had my door kicked down. I've had my computer stolen. I've been shadow banned, I believe, for 8 years. And weird things happening, and my website, people coming to visit my house, my mailbox getting knocked down, things that I believe that when I would get close to the truth of what was going on or saying something when I shouldn't, I realized that I had to kind of self-censor myself. And I find myself still doing that to this day because I want to continue to have my podcast. And I know I can get dirty and I could figure out all kinds of things. And sometimes I'd look at your work and you seem to go down that realm where I would kind of be scared to be honest with you, because I have a family and you're naming certain names and links and references. And this is serious stuff. And these people, if you do the research, could be considered killers, meaning they've killed a lot of people or have had people killed. And I'm sure more than we even know. Not all of them, but what are your thoughts on self-censoring and what you put out there? And are you ever scared for your life?
I mean, I would certainly say that I do censor, but that's primarily, well, A, to protect sources sometimes, and then B, also because I don't want people knowing too much about like projects that I'm researching if it's going to be something very sensitive, which is a lot of the stuff I am looking at presently is. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that, I mean, you have to kind of consider, especially since I have had a fair amount of strange things happen, especially like in the last year or two or something like that. I do have an advantage that I live out in the middle of nowhere in West Virginia, so it's pretty easy to get yourself shot if you're wandering around here and people don't know who you are. So I think that's maybe deterred some potential gang stalking and that type of thing on me to some extent. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that you do have to consider about. And I mean, certainly with some of the things that I've gotten into lately, yeah, uh, definitely have to, do a kind of a dark night of the soul sometimes with some of these things.
Yeah, and let's go to some of your research. If you could give the listeners out there maybe a synopsis of your research over the last 10 years, and then we'll get to now to modern times. Let's go a little bit on kind of give people a brief history of the parapolitics. What does that mean? Because some people don't understand what that means. And then also what your line of work, what you found over that decade of research and research and publishing as well.
Well, parapolitics was really I think it was a term. Gosh, it definitely wasn't Peter Dale Scott who coined it. I should know this. I just read Eric Wilson's book on that. But anyway, it was basically an attempt to try to really scholarly study the mechanisms of the deep state effectively. And it really came into its own, I would say, probably in the 80s, with a lot of publications from, was it South End Press, I think. I mean, that's where you got a lot of stuff like Russ Belant, his great book, was it Old Nazis, the Republican Party and the New Right, or something like that. And this was really, I think, a reaction to Iran-Contra, but up to that point in time, of course, most of the conspiracy theories that had come out were mostly crude Cold War era propaganda from like the John Birch Society. Kind of beginning in the Watergate era, you started seeing more legitimate researchers like Peter Dale Scott, who tried to do something in contrast to this that would be like a formal study, looking at primary source material, going, to actual people to interview them and that type of thing. And I would say in kind of essence, that's really at the heart of the difference between parapolitics and like conspiracy theory. I mean, in conspiracy theory, you have this one source for this book that has been cited like 50 times, in all these other, conspiracy texts. Nobody has ever even really seen the original source material. And when you track it down, it turns out to say almost something totally different than what, countless other authors have been reporting for over the years. So that's kind of one of the things is you're trying to meticulously, document this stuff and use primary source material as much as possible, which is something I really can't emphasize enough. Really the good stories, the ones that have never been told before, and I say this just kind of speaking as an artist, those are in FOIA requests, those are in personal papers, collections at, universities and institutions like Hoover and that type of thing. The stuff that nobody's ever really, seen before or had a chance to properly analyze. And, that's really where the gold truly is waiting to be found, which is something that most conspiracy theorists do not realize and do not attempt to do. And, honestly, I didn't even really try to do this until a couple of years ago, but, it definitely upped my game quite a bit and gave me a taste of what it was like being an actual scholar as opposed to just somebody kind of randomly, sourcing stuff on the internet or something like that. So
Yeah, and let's talk just briefly about that. Do you believe that this was different disinformation that was purposely put out there, possibly by the deep state, and then people just regurgitate that information and they don't do their research, which we know is very common. I find that with a lot of history when I'm researching, so I have to do exactly like you. I want to know to go back to the source.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really true when you look at a lot of the stuff linked to like the John Birch Society. I mean, a good example of that would be like Tragedy and Hope. Okay. I mean, you probably heard of The Naked Capitalist by, was it Cleon, shoot, the Mormon guy. I can't remember his name now, but
Yeah.
anyway, Tragedy and Hope was not like available at large to the American public for many years. It was out of public circulation. So most people only got their information on Tragedy and Hope from what you saw in books like The Naked Capitalist and these other sort of publications linked to the John Birch Society. And there are definitely some paragraphs in Tragedy and Hope where if you cherry pick them and put them up without any context to them, they seem really nefarious. But when you actually sit down and read all, was it 1,300 pages of Quigley's very copious text, you start to get a bigger picture of what he was getting at. And it's definitely in stark contrast to what groups like the JBS were trying to depict it as. But I mean, certainly there's no indication of some, Byzantine communist plot, which Tragedy and Hope was, often held up as being, the smoking gun of for years and years. And that's kind of like what I'm getting at. I mean, so many people just repeated these claims about Tragedy and Hope for years without ever having bothered to actually read the book.
Yeah, I mean, we see that all throughout the truth movement. One of those, we can go to what happened with Damien Eccles and the story with the Memphis Three, and just that same story got repeated. Of the Damien Eccles side of it. And if you research the history and what really happened there, they are convicted and they never were exonerated. And in my opinion, they're as guilty as can be, but they got let out based on the money behind these guys, I believe, and then the pressure that was put upon the legal system at the time. But in any event, that would just be a small example. There's people that just believe the story, they believe the movie, the Johnny Depp kind of version of the story. Then if you research the other side of it, I believe they are guys that are convicted child killers that are doing black magic and getting paid for high magic, Damien Eccles, to basically, and they're child killers that I believe should still be behind bars, if not their heads cut off, in my opinion. But what are your thoughts there, like that story? I don't know if you've written upon that, but let's talk a little bit about these stories that go out there as one version, like this one that I mentioned, and then it's a different one. Can you maybe name other ones or comment on this one?
Well, as far as the West Memphis Three goes, I mean, that's one that I've really bounced back and forth a lot over the years, and I'm still kind of up in the air on it. But like, let me ask you, okay, have you found any really concrete evidence that these kids had an interest in occultism before the murders?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't prepared to talk on this, meaning, I don't have it, as we do a lot of research, all of us. But yeah, there was quite a few references during the trial, and then after that, he was into Aleister Crowley and into Satanism as well.
But I mean, did he actually perform rituals or anything like that, or?
I don't think there's any references to him doing that. No. So, there was just, what I feel the references to him knowing certain things about the crime scene, that he had mentioned. I don't know if you knew that, but he was asked during the investigation, you know, if he knew, like, for example, if you were the killer, what would you do? And he had basically said,
Yeah,
you
I
know,
mean,
I would. So
I
there was
mean, to
just certain.
me, it's possible that, yeah, they had like an involvement in it, but I mean, see, my whole issue is basically the depiction of them as doing this elaborate satanic rite, which to me is problematic on a few levels. And I think I have a bit of a unique perspective in this because I was a metalhead who grew up in roughly the same era. I think I was maybe a few years after them, but in the South, the same kind of like cultural milieu. I owned, I think, a copy of the Satanic Bible when I was in high school and one Aleister Crowley book, and I had never read more than like a single page in each, I think. And generally speaking, I was usually the smartest man in the room, sadly, when it came to magic and occultism, even back in that era. So that is sort of my whole issue. I think that kids might have been involved, but the whole notion that they were the ones specifically going out here and trying to stage like this kind of elaborate satanic ritual, especially when they were still teenagers. I mean, if you ever partied with metalheads from that
Yeah.
era, that would
Well,
it just like almost makes you want to burst out laughing.
yeah, no, I believe a lot of people don't know what they're doing when they get into this. And I actually believe a lot of the stuff that's out there is actually put out there to fool them and to actually work against them. And that's what a lot of people don't understand when they get into magic. Just like when you get into the truth movement and you're trying to look for different things or true history, as you might want to say, and you know there's a lot of disinformation. So there's also disinformation in the magical movement, from what I found. And a lot of the black magic from my research actually works in reverse. But yeah, I agree with you. There's a lot of people that don't read the stuff, and they probably, I don't believe it was a black magic ritual that they were trying to do, but they were doing some type of satanic ritual and going through with something. There was just too much that was involved. And again, I don't want to kind of make it about that, but is there any other examples that, you know, that you could give maybe that mean something to you that you could let the audience know about, that say it's this one truth that's kind of the narrative, and 90% of the public believes it, but it's really this truth. I don't know if there's any examples that you could bring up or something modern possibly.
Let me see. I'm trying to think here. Something. Oh, okay, okay. Well, let's talk about like the behavioral modification programs here briefly.
Okay.
Okay, so like the common narrative that's pushed for this is that you had Bluebird, which was started in around 48, 49, and then it was rolled into Artichoke in 51, and then Artichoke became MK Ultra around 53 or 54, and then everything from there on out was totally overseen by Gottlieb until like 73 or something. That is completely wrong. Artichoke was never a part of MK Ultra, never, and it continued concurrently with MK Ultra to at least 63 when it was broken up into sub-projects the way that MK Ultra was. And see, this is really significant because there was actually quite a bit of rivalry between the technical services staff, which is what oversaw MK Ultra, and the Office of Security, which is what oversaw Artichoke. It's just really fascinating because I mean, I believe when John Marks got the cache of documents, you know, for what eventually became the search for the Manchurian Candidate in the late 90s or late 70s, every single name in these cache of documents was blacked out. Every single one except one name, and that name was Sidney Gottlieb. The Black Magician of the CIA, the Dark Prince, the man who's been involved in all these nefarious activities, was the one name the CIA gave to John Marks, which should raise a lot of red flags about the conventional narrative about him. Yeah, and conversely, Morris Allen, the guy who oversaw Artichoke for a lot of years, we don't even know when he died. Okay, there's almost nothing known about this guy other than, you know, some of the stuff that he was involved in the early to mid 50s with Artichoke. He was in the CIA until at least the late 1960s. He might have turned it up in the freaking Martin Luther King assassination. He was involved in some kind of private detective agency, which is usually a front for government work in the 70s onwards. But we don't know any of this stuff about the guy. Nothing. So, you know, that's like one of the things when I look at a lot of these narratives about the behavioral modification programs, it's just so much distorted history there, and it keeps getting repeated over and over again.
Yeah, and let's talk a little bit about, say, MK Ultra and then Project Mockingbird. What are your thoughts and knowledge on those two projects?
What do you mean if there was like an overlap between them or something to that
Yeah,
effect?
yeah, exactly.
I don't know if there was a formal overlap with Mockingbird. In the case of MK Ultra, though, there was definitely an interest in applying MK Ultra methods to psychological warfare. I mean, really going as far back as the mid 50s. I mean, essentially, they were considering something akin to, what Naomi Klein would later refer to as the shock doctrine. Basically, could you take the methods that have been developed in artichoke, which was known as the artichoke treatment, where you essentially disorient someone with electroshock therapy and LSD and all this other stuff, and could this be applied on a societal basis to create kind of a fugue state where society could be reprogrammed? So yeah, this was something that was already being looked at as far back as the 50s or so, and it actually kind of seems like one of the methods for this that they had explored were conspiracy theories. Essentially,
Yeah,
that would be a kind of proverbial shock that could, substitute for an electroshock.
yeah. Didn't they dose the CIA dose like a whole town in a different country? I don't know if you heard about that. I heard
Yeah,
that
that was
recently.
yeah. That was the theory that they had dosed the one town in France. Oh shoot,
Yeah.
I can't remember its name now. But yes, there's some speculation that that actually might have been what had led to Frank Olson's suicide.
Sure. And what kind of overlap did you see to Project Mockingbird? And do you feel like Project Mockingbird that's now goes into alternative media as well and is a different? Do you think that's morphed into something else?
Well, I don't know so much about alternative media, but I mean, I think, or excuse me, Mockingbird, but I mean, I think that's always been an element with alternative media. I mean, what is it? I mean, for years, one of the big advocates for this kind of stuff was what the Christic Institute, I think, which was set up by Daniel Sheehan, I think. But again, this was like an institution that was basically getting a ton of support from like the Jesuits and what have you. I mean, Desjardins was a major influence for this. So, I mean, even sadly, when you go back and you look at, like the New Left, and I mean, some of the movements that did actually contribute to shining a light on these, deep state intrigues and so forth in the 70s, I mean, even they were, in a sense, controlled opposition going back to that era, and probably set up, I think, by the business interests effectively to try to keep the military and the CIA in line. I would say there's probably more of a rivalry between those two than is generally acknowledged.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Jesuits, and you probably know all too well the Jesuits have a play in the creation of the United States of America as well as the Freemasons. I would say the Jesuits are maybe one of the oldest secret societies. I don't know if you would consider them that. They often talk about they had the Black Pope and then they have the White Pope, and we have Pope Francis, of course, the first Jesuit Pope. What are your thoughts on the Jesuits and secret societies and possibly them being one of the apex secret societies controlling the pyramid?
Well, I mean, they're definitely one of the most influential. I mean, I think specifically their obsession with education really rubbed off on a lot of these other groups. I know my research partner, Keith Allen Dennis, was a Mason for a time. And in one of the lodge meetings, he was effectively told that the Department of Education had been set up by the Masons as a rivalry to the Jesuit schools, which were essentially the dominant force in the United States up to that point in time. So it's kind of an interesting take on that because you hear all the Masonic conspiracies behind like the founding of a lot of the institutions in the US, but then you also have to wonder how much of this stuff was done to counter the Jesuits in the first place. Um, but in terms of recent times, I think the Jesuits do get overplayed in terms of like the Vatican hierarchy. I mean, there's really been kind of an ongoing civil war, I think, in the Vatican, at least since probably the late 70s, between the Jesuits and some of the more liberal leaning sects on the one hand, and on the other hand, groups like the Knights of Malta and Opus Dei and Legatus and those types of groups. But I mean, going back to the late 70s when the Jesuits, had started to embrace liberation theology. You had Pope John Paul II come to power, and there's There's a lot of theories about what happened to the first Pope John Paul to enable the second one to come to power, but I won't get into that now. But John Paul II comes into power and he basically strips the head of the Jesuits of his title and tries to put his own guy in control. And Pope John Paul II had a lot of backing from Opus Dei and the Knights of Malta. He was very much their guy, as was his successor, Pope Benedict. So you had this almost like 30 years or so where, I mean, really this sort of Psalm / Opus Dei faction was really in the driver's seat. But it kind of seems like the sex scandals were actually used to effectively force Benedict out and put Francis in there. And now you've got a Jesuit Pope who's effectively trying to do the same thing to the Knights of Malta that they did to the Jesuits years ago. I mean, he basically, eliminated the Knights of Malta's Grand Master and tried to put like a new guy, his own guy, in charge of the order. So it's kind of interesting how you're seeing these intrigues sort of playing out between these two very old organizations. I mean, the Knights of Malta, of course, goes all the way back to the Knights Hospitaller. So they've been in the game for a couple of years now as well.
Yeah, and you write about this, and then you also write, of course, on the Orthodox side, and you have almost what I would call possibly the traditionalists that aren't as liberal as would be the Roman side. What are your thoughts on the Orthodox side and any knighthoods? Do you believe there's still two competing factions, or do you believe they're two heads of the same bird?
Do you mean, are you talking about the Orthodox Christians in this sense?
Yeah, the Orthodox Christians, and you write about the Knights of St. John as well. Do you believe they're tied to more on the Orthodox side as opposed to the Roman Catholic side? And then you also see the big ecumenical movement where a lot of the Catholics are they're upset that the Pope is meeting with all these different religious faiths and pagan faiths and so forth. As if they're all uniting as one religion, is the fear, one new world order of one religion and so forth that we're all under. Do you believe in that conspiracy at all? And again, let's start with the Orthodox side. I know I sometimes ask like 4 questions at once.
It's okay. It's okay. Well,
all right.
Well, as far as the Order of St. John goes, I mean, they were always non-denominational, so they didn't, I mean, they had ties to the Orthodox Church and a lot of the different ones, but I mean, it certainly was never just a strictly only an Orthodox thing. I mean, they had Protestant knights, Catholic knights, all kinds of ones, though the Orthodox Church, I would say, certainly does have a considerable amount of influence in modern day Russia and probably in the security services there and that type of thing. But oddly, yeah, I mean, the Knights of St. John were almost trailblazers for this kind of insanity because, I mean, they were so into like orgone energy, I mean, ufology, all of this other stuff. I mean, it's almost impossible to even explain to people how strange this organization was. I mean, it's like on the one hand, you've got knights like Pedro del Valle writing to like George Lincoln Rockwell, the founder of the American Nazi Party, like sending him checks and, here's $10,000, kid, give the Jews hell. And then on the other hand, you've got like Charles Pachel, the essentially the head of the order for many years, writing to his orgone energy specialist about how they can, recruit Ingo Swann, the remote viewer, into the Knights of St. John. I mean, just this kind of insane stuff. I mean, it could really be anything to any people. But in terms of like a new world religion, I think a lot of this was really driven more so by psychological operations going back really to the onset of the Second World War. I mean, on the one hand, a lot of like the modern Christian right was largely crafted by the spiritual mobilization movement that had been set up by J. Howard Pugh, who's an interesting guy in his own right. But the thing with Pugh, though, I mean, he was involved with Gerald Hurd, the famous British philosopher. In fact, Hurd was actually a part of an inner circle in spiritual mobilization, I think, called the Wayfarers. But Hurd, I mean, he was really a guy who set up a lot of the modern counterculture. I mean, he was openly homosexual, I mean, all the way back in the 1920s. He was experimenting with psychedelics. I mean, he was one of the guys who had tripped early with Aldous Huxley. In fact, I think Huxley and Hurd had actually come to California together at one point, shortly before the Second World War. But I mean, he had helped kind of set up the predecessor to the Eastland Institute, and just in general brought in this sort of study of the various world religions. Certainly an influence, I think, that he had picked up from Theosophy. So it's kind of like when you go and you look at this just nexus in California, Southern California, you know, leading up to the Second World War and shortly after, you have basically the genesis of the modern Christian right on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you have the genesis of the New Age movement as well. And I think ultimately, I mean, both of these groups were effectively being set up by big business, ultimately for the purposes of applying dignity to labor, or something to that effect. I mean, when you look at Willis Harman's changing images of man thing, I mean, it's kind of going into, you know, how can we bring new spiritual impulse to work, or this kind of stuff. I mean, yeah, the dignity of labor.
Yeah, and let's talk about that. Do you believe that, you know, when all this liberalism was brought in, and you know, these ideas, and we kind of, the American way was kind of the selfish way, and if you look at it, it's almost like we were, you know, God was taken out of the equation in religion, and it was almost as if we were turned on to Satanism and Gnosticism and Theosophy and all these different things. And then during this time, you know, from World War II, we look at all our technologies and we look at all the things that we built and all the selfishness and things that we've created, and you know, in what they say the American dream is, you know, in search of the American dream and making money and starting a business or creating a product. Do you believe that where we're at now, all this technology is the result of aliens bringing it to us and talking into Jack Parsons' ears, or just, you know, us pursuing liberalism and our own individuality, which before that we really didn't do as a society? It was more Christianity and more inhibited, where we lived kind of, you know, and we were probably really ignorant. You know, we just learned to read and write, you know, over the past 100 years or 200 years, maybe 500 years ago, you know, that we didn't even know how to read. So what are your thoughts there?
Well, I mean, I think in terms of, I mean, the advances of technology, I do think that there's a good chance that some other kind of intelligence was contributing to this. I mean, of course, theurgy was really rediscovered in the West in a big way during the Renaissance. And I mean, it kind of seems like there's been this ongoing overlap between these channeled communications and the advances in technology, kind of going all the way back to John Dee. And specifically, it's a lot of these, you know, so-called angelic communications that seem to be at the heart of a lot of this. I mean, you know, obviously the Enochian system that Dee had developed was later adopted by the Golden Dawn and Crowley and all of these other people. But I mean, he wasn't the only one trying to come up with ways of communicating with these angels, if you will. The Moravians, for instance, also were quite obsessed with that. So, you know, I mean, we definitely have had, you know, a good 500 years or so where the highest circles of power have been, you know, really fanatical about this kind of stuff, to the extent that I really don't think that normal people can grasp. But getting into your question about liberalism, I don't think it's really an issue of liberalism so much as libertarianism. I mean, that was really at the heart of a lot of the 60s counterculture. I mean, a lot of the early figures that we sort of associate with it, people like Carrie Thornley, Robert Anton Wilson, Stuart Brand, Robert A. Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land. All this stuff was coming out of libertarianism. If you really read a lot of the accounts of the counterculture in the 60s and the early 60s, before 64, it was all rooted in like Randism and this kind of thing. And I think that current, you know, was never really taken out of the counterculture. So there was always this sort of innate glorification of the individual and selfishness that's been at the heart of it. And certainly, I think as the years have gone on, that's become even more devastating.
Yeah, and we now have the woke movement, of course, going on right now. It
Well,
just
yeah,
seems like, go ahead.
it's like I think really what distinguishes like classical liberalism and conservatism from libertarianism ultimately is that in the case of both, there is a sense of social responsibility, and I'm talking about like classical liberalism in terms of socialism or something like that, and also conservatism. I mean, that's something that I think tends to get overlooked, but most conservatives and most socialists believe in some sense of a public good. they might question what the public good is, but they believe that there is such a thing as the public good. Whereas, I mean, when you get into libertarianism, it's all about the individual. The public good, you know, is totally jettisoned at the altar of personal freedom.
So where does this lead us? Do you do you believe that we're just going to continue down the road to further division and chaos and the insanity that we see now in media and towns and with the woke movements and the BLM? Do you eventually see a line being divided in humanity where you're either on one side for the common good? That doesn't mean we all have to wear white shirts and say the same thing, but we all agree on these common precepts and these ideas. And then if you're on the other side where, you know, you just want to do thou wilt, you live over here. Or do you believe we're just going to keep doing this chaos forever?
Well, I think the current paradigm is probably going to burn out in the next couple of years. I don't think this kind of division is sustainable. I mean, it's going to eventually turn into a civil war or something, but I mean, eventually it will have to burn out, I think, and probably sooner than later. It's just not a state of affairs that can continue.
What's your prediction with the powers that be and the various secret societies with humanity? So this burns out. Are we just continuing down this road that we're going down, and we just kind of figured out kind of like what's been happening, and nothing ever changes other than just different words and movements and different things going on? Or do you feel that eventually things change in a different society? Do you feel the powers that be have something planned for us with all of this chaos?
Well, I mean, I think definitely different factions have something planned for us, but I mean, whether or not it's actually going to work out the way they're planning, I think is definitely very debatable. Um, but yeah, I mean, I don't like to really put a time frame on any of this, but I mean, I do think the current state of chaos will probably come to a head in the next decade or so. And, you know, a lot of things could come out of that. You know, maybe it'll be for the positive, and we'll get a totally new paradigm that'll be more inclusive, and will actually, you know, be something that will try to elevate the public as a whole. Maybe it'll just simply continue with the same root of selfishness. Or maybe we'll simply destroy ourselves as a species. That's also something that cannot be discounted in this current world order that we're living in. You know, I like to hope that it will be the first scenario. But yeah, I definitely worry that it might be the third one.
Yeah. And the reason you put a timeline is because like this coronavirus, this lockdown, these things going on, you feel that with what has happened, they could do something of this scale and make something happen. Is that why?
Yeah, I think, I mean, if we are going into this full-blown Orwellian future that, I mean, the conspiratorial right's been warning about for years now, I think it's going to happen in like the next couple of years, because I mean, disillusionment with the American empire is just so widespread around the rest of the world right now. I really think that the Chinese, and I mean some of the other major powers, have you know, kind of had it with the Americans trying to dominate all of this. Yeah, I just think that if it's going to come into play, it's got to happen soon, because they're frankly running out of time. If it does not happen in the next couple of years, the current, you know, Pax Americana is going to collapse, and inevitably something will have to replace it.
Definitely, definitely. Stephen, thanks for your time today. And this is Stephen's website. It's visup, V-I-S-U-P, view.blogspot.com. And his screen name is Recluse, that he's went under for several years now. And then this is your new book as well. Let's open that up here. Cool. Is this available for purchase right now?
Yep. You can get it at the Farm's official store, which is the farmpodcast.store. And it is also available in physical copies at Amazon.
Awesome. And let the audience know a little bit about what this book is about, so they could, if they want to purchase it.
Well, it's the first in the trilogy of books that I'm writing to sort of explore Epstein's network. And in this case, we go back really to the origins with the World Commerce Corporation and all of the intrigues that went on in the second half, excuse me, in the aftermath of the Second World War. Finally kind of climaxing with Perfumo, which I think is a great scandal to understand how the Game of Thrones is actually played in real life.
Definitely, definitely. And we just only covered a small smidgen of your research. I know literally every subject we probably could have talked a couple hours on, and we both have a life and research to get to. So, Stephen, again, thank you for your time. I'll put a link to this, your website, and also this book on my website, and then I'll go ahead and send you a copy of this in the next few days.
All right, I appreciate it, sir.
All right, thank you. Take care, buddy.
You too.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.